David es doctor en filosofía por la Universidad Humboldt de Berlín. Él realizó sus estudios de maestría en la Universidad Libre de Berlín, donde se especializó en filosofía, historia de la ciencia y la tecnología y ciencia cognitiva. Fue estudiante asistente en el Instituto Max Planck de Historia de la Ciencia, investigador postdoctoral en la Universidad de Columbia y también en la Universidad Libre de Ámsterdam. Desde 2017, él es profesor asistente en la Universidad de Wageningen, que está en Holanda, como decíamos, en los Países Bajos, y entre sus líneas de investigación actualmente se encuentran filosofía de la ciencia, epistemología, ontología, filosofía de la etnobiología, muy específicamente, que es el tema del cual va a hablar hoy, y también filosofía de la raza, que es del área de la que se va a tratar el seminario que va a auspiciar Carlos López Beltrán y su grupo de investigación aquí en Filosóficas. Yo conocí a David hace un par de años en el Congreso de Sao Paulo de la Iscabibel y desde entonces empezamos a planear, bueno, él sobre todo tuvo la iniciativa de un número especial para la revista Studies in History and Philosophy of the Biological and Biomedical Sciences, estoy ayudándole a editarla. El título de este número especial se titula Etnobiología, perspectivas desde la historia, filosofía y sociología de la ciencia. Asimismo, también David está ahorita editando un libro que se titula Epistemologías y filosofías globales de la ciencia, y otro volumen también que se llama Aplicación responsable de la investigación y la innovación, condiciones organizativas y nacionales. El 26 y 27 de febrero, o sea, esta misma semana, va a participar en un taller en el Centro Internacional de Mejoramiento de Maíz y Trigo, CIMIT, en Texcoco. Entonces, esto ya los ubica a ustedes que entre las cosas que vino a hacer en su viaje es hacer un poco de trabajo de campo en relación con algunos de los proyectos de investigación que tiene ahora en puerta, iniciando. Entre ellos está uno muy interesante que le va a financiar la organización holandesa para la investigación científica, que se llama, si traduzco del español, del inglés al español, etnoontologías, relacionando la metafísica y la práctica de la diversidad de saberes. Sin más, David. And his presentation will be in English because, well, he surely understands Spanish, but maybe it would be better to have it in English.
Thanks for coming. So it's really nice to be here and to be able to give a little bit of an overview of the research that I'm going to develop partly in Mexico over the next 5 years. So I hope I'll be back and this is more like the beginning of a longer conversation. And who knows, maybe next time I'll even manage to give the talk in Spanish, but we'll see. But so the projects that I'm here for are kind of on issues of global knowledge diversity, especially connected to knowledge about biology. And so a large part of it is philosophical, but we try to combine it with empirical work. And so part of the empirical work will be done in Brazil, and the other part will be done in Mexico, and that's why I'm here to kind of talk with people and to find field sites and all of that. But it's also nice, of course, to connect to the philosophical community here, so I hope it will be a nice opportunity for us to kind of discuss what's interesting about this. And so I thought for today I'm just going to give you kind of like a broad talk that outlines the kind of basic assumptions and goals of the projects that we're developing that are broadly structured around questions of development, which I feel are questions that philosophers are not engaging enough with. So development is a concept that structures policy regimes around the world, like, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, that are then structuring, for example, how global policies work, how research funding works, and so on, and in the end affect the livelihoods of billions of people around the world. So as philosophers, I think we should be very much engaged with the very concept of development and the question how development regimes are structured. But somehow looking at the mainstream of academic philosophy, that's mostly happening in ethics. There's kind of like a subfield of ethics called development ethics, and people are doing great work there. But if you look in other fields of philosophy, like philosophy of science, where I'm coming from, or the mainstream of epistemological or ontological debates. People are not really concerned with the notion of development or the way how development regimes work. So that's kind of where the projects come in that I want to talk about. And so for today, I'm broadly going to talk about 3 different themes. First, I wanted to talk a little bit more generally about the question why epistemological and ontological consideration matter when engaging with development questions. And then on the basis of that, I kind of want to outline the methodology that we're kind of developing and trying to address those questions, and then present some preliminary ideas and results of the kind of pluralist framework that we're developing and engaging with that. So to start with, the broader question of epistemology and ontology of development, I think it's worthwhile to think a little bit about the very concept of development that is actually pretty recent in its modern notion of international development, largely emerged in the second half of the 20th century and the post-war era, as the idea that somehow the developed countries have all this like great scientific and technological knowledge that's transferred to the underdeveloped countries and will make everyone's lives better there. And as you all know, often the reality of development projects is quite different, right? Often development projects fail to make people's lives better, and sometimes they make people's lives worse. And so part of what I want to argue for and what our projects are about is trying to understand how development projects fail for epistemological and ontological reasons. And the overall outline is, I think, relatively straightforward because traditional development has like a very simple epistemic hierarchy built into it, right? It's the idea that the scientist, typically coming from the developed northern country, has all the knowledge, right? And then the knowledge is transferred into the underdeveloped countries where people don't have the knowledge. And then people are surprised that things don't work that way, right? Because the knowledge that's been developed by the scientists is not adapted to the local context, or the local knowledge that has already been there has been just not recognized. And as a result, the interventions actually make people's lives worse rather than better. And so to kind of give that a little bit more substance, I wanted to talk about like 2 classic cases of failed development projects that come from the anthropological literature. So the first story is set in Indonesia, in Bali in the 1970s, and it's described by the anthropologist Stephen Lansing in this great book, Priests and Programmers. And so he did his field work in Bali in the 1970s when the so-called Green Revolution hit Indonesia, right? And so Bali is an island that's where the agriculture production is largely based on rice. And so Bali had this like very complicated traditional system of rice farming where the water flow was regulated through traditional ceremonies and water temples that would determine when water would get on the fields and how much water. And so when the agricultural scientists in the 1970s came to this island, they said, oh, well, that's just a terribly outdated system that we just have to get rid of. And we replace it with like a more efficient watering system, more efficient rice varieties, fertilizers, pesticides, all that kind of stuff that would increase productivity, would kickstart the local economy and make people's lives better. And as you can probably already guess, it was a complete disaster. Because what happened was that by getting rid of the traditional system of like agriculture and water management, there were a lot of water shortages in the dry season, so people just didn't have water on their fields. There were pest outbreaks because the new varieties were not resistant to local pests. And in the end, the whole system collapsed and makes things very bad for the local farming communities. So Lansing describes the situation as this. He writes, "The threat of legal penalties against anyone failing to grow the new rice led to continuous cropping of Green Revolution rice," so the new kind of varieties that the scientists introduced, Religious rituals continued in the temples, which were the rituals that determined how the water would flow onto the rice fields. But field rituals no longer matched the actual stages of rice growth. As soon as one crop was harvested, another was planted, and cropping cycles began to drift apart. During the dry season, the supply of irrigation water became unpredictable. Soon, district agricultural offices began to report chaos in the water scheduling and explosions of pest populations. So here we have like a classic case of like a failed development project where scientists introduced a lot of new technologies and came with their own knowledge, assuming it would make things better, and it made things worse. And one thing that's interesting about this case is that it so obviously reflects the kind of epistemic failures of a lot of these interventions, because the system in Bali that people had was already based on very complex knowledge about how the local ecosystem worked, about how to manage local pests, how to distribute water. But because the scientists assumed, well, that's just like temples and rituals and all this kind of like old-fashioned religious stuff that's inefficient anyway, they just got rid of it and created a system that worked much worse, right? So in the end, why the things went so badly was because local knowledge was not recognized, and instead the assumption was that the only one who has the knowledge is the scientist who comes from outside and creates intervention. The second story I wanted to tell is kind of similar, but it's set in a different context. In Tanzania, back, again, I think in the 70s, when Tanzania was still a socialist country, and the idea was to kind of improve the livelihoods of the poorest local communities that were often nomadic. And so there was this campaign that was set up by the government of Tanzania called the Ujamaa campaign, where the idea was to bring the local nomadic communities into villages, help them to grow food rather than like live their traditional nomadic lifestyles, and by that improve their livelihoods and improve the economy of Tanzania. So what the scientists and development workers did, they developed these kind of villages that you can see very like nicely, rationally constructed, where people were supposed to live. And again, as you can imagine, it completely failed. So Lansing describes the situation as this: faith in what officials took for scientific agriculture on the one hand, and a nearly total skepticism about the actual agricultural practices of Africans on the other. As a provincial agricultural officer put it, the African has neither the training, skill, nor equipment, which are based on scientific knowledge. And this is where I think we rightly come in. So they created these villages with like supposedly scientific agriculture, and it didn't work, partly because the local ecosystem was just too different from what the scientists thought. So there was a lot of soil erosion. The crops that were assumed to grow there, they wouldn't grow. People wouldn't want to grow the crops they were supposed to grow. And they also just didn't want to live in those villages, right? Because their way of life was a nomadic way of life. So people ran away from the villages. And in the end, like in the beginning, the government tried to convince them because they had like good intentions, right? They wanted to improve people's lives. But then when they just didn't stay in the villages, they were kind of like therefore forced to stay in the villages, which made it even worse. And at some point, this whole Ujamaa village campaign was abandoned. And again, it's a case where I think the failure of a development project is very clearly linked to epistemic failures of assuming that it's like the kind of scientific agriculture that is produced in the already developed countries where all the knowledge that's necessary is there. Local people don't have any knowledge, so we're just kind of putting that there and somehow it will make things better. And that's not how it works, right? And so in the end, I think this is something that has become quite widely recognized in the development literature in environmental sciences and social sciences. And there's, of course, not only an entanglement of development questions and epistemology, but often ontological and metaphysical questions come into play as well, which is something we'll get back to later. But you can already see that, for example, in the case of the water temples, where, of course, there's a lot of local ecological knowledge about that system, but that is so much embedded in a local way of looking at the world, of being in the world, that it was difficult for scientists to relate to that, so they simply ignored it, right? And so in the, more like a lot of empirical sciences, also here in Latin America, there's been a lot of reflection on that, right? So one thing that's currently hot in the development circles are all these debates about the so-called pluriverse, right? The idea that there's just not one universal ontology, but we live in a plurality of universes that have different metaphysical systems, different ontologies that create different ways of being in the world, different ways of creating knowledge, different practices. This is, of course, also something that has been reflected in a lot of scholarship here in Mexico. So I've just put a picture to Toledo's work here that also, of course, emphasizes not only the local knowledge that people have about environments, that they have about biodiversity, but also how it is entangled with local cosmovisions and local ways of being in the world. Now, one thing that I feel is kind of troubling is that academic philosophers have not really engaged with that, right? If you look at a mainstream journal in epistemology or in ontology, you will not find any of that stuff. And the situation in philosophy of science is a little bit better, but not much better, right? If you go to the Philosophy of Science Association or something, you will also not find a lot of talk about things like that. So the idea of the kind of projects that we aim to develop is to create the kind of dialogue between, if you want, academic philosophy and the scholarship and critical development studies that shows how development issues are entangled with epistemological and ontological questions. Right? And so this is where the kind of projects come in that we're going to work on in the next 5 years, and where we'll also plan to do some empirical work here in Mexico. Now, the part in Mexico is not there yet. I'm here to kind of figure things out. But there's another part that's in Brazil that's already a little bit more set up. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that we're doing there. And then I can maybe talk a little bit more also about what we're planning to do here. So there are two projects. The one is funded by the European Research Council, that's more on the epistemological side. The other one is funded by the Dutch National Science Foundation that looks more on the ontological side. And a lot that we set up in Brazil is located in two small fishing villages in the northeast of the country, in Bahia. And we developed those projects almost 2 years ago. So that was before Brazil elected a fascist president, and it was also before last fall the villages in which we were hit by the worst oil spill that the country had ever experienced. So I don't know whether you read about that, kind of went through the media. There was a lot of oil, no one knew where it actually came from, and the whole coastline of the northeast of Brazil was devastated by it. So when we were kind of doing our preliminary fieldwork there last November and December, a lot of the initial ideas that we had about how to set things up changed quite a bit, and a lot of the abstract philosophical questions went in the background because there was just a lot of oil, and the communities rely on the fish, right? 95% of the income of those villages is fish. And no one knows how toxic the fish is because the government, after the oil came, picked up some of the bigger patches of oil with the military, and then they left and they said everything is fine. So one of the things we ended up doing, rather than doing philosophy, is a crowdfunding campaign. I'm not sure whether this is going to work. Let's see.
O que eu quero dizer é que quero dizer para eles que a gente não somos descartáveis. só ligam pra gente quando a gente tá na frente da urna. Olhe pra nós. O mangue tá se acabando, o rio tá se acabando. E com isso a gente também. Nos ajude. Nos socorra. É isso.
So do I Okay, so that was just to give you first a little bit of an impression of the communities that we work in, but also of the very concrete social and environmental issues that we're trying to engage with when thinking about epistemological matters and ontological matters, right? So part of the question that we're trying to face here now is like how scientific knowledge, for example, of researchers in toxicology and the local knowledge of the community can interact in addressing this kind of problem that the community faces, right? Because there are parts of, for example, scientific knowledge that is necessary in engaging with that. No one knows how toxic the fish is, right? And for that we need laboratory studies, right? We need to get the fish and put it in the lab and figure out like whether it's edible or not, right? So there's like scientific knowledge that's needed. At the same time, there's a lot of local knowledge that's needed in order to address that as well, right? The kind of knowledge that the community has about, for example, where the oil still is, where certain fish can be found, and about the local ecological dynamics within the ecosystem. So that's kind of like the broader context in which we work. And so our starting point methodologically has been ethnobiology and ethnoecology, kind of as the idea that we're not just assuming that it is like the external scientist who has knowledge, right? But we start with the knowledge and the expertise that the community already has about animals, about plants, about the ecosystem in which they live, right? So what you see there in the background is one of the villages, Posas, where the fisherman lives that you just saw, right? And then the hope is that by doing that, we kind of create a more diverse epistemic community, right? That of course includes academically trained researchers like Gabriela or Vitor, who are two of my PhD students there, but then also local community experts, right? Like for example, Rafael, who's been fishing in the mangroves for 40 years. He knows much better like a lot of the local ecological dynamics than any scientist who comes from the outside, right? Or Fernando, who's a teacher and also a fisher, and who has a lot of expertise about how to translate the local community knowledge into educational contexts, right? So the idea is then that we bring together different types of knowledge in addressing like pressing social environmental problems like, for example, the oil spill that occurred last fall. And in order to do that, and that's kind of where we then do ethno-epistemological or ethno-ontological studies, we're trying to understand how local production of knowledge works, how local validation of knowledge works. And I can't walk you through all the details of the empirical work that we're setting up there, but we can talk about that later. This is kind of one example of one of the most important fish there, the robalo. And this is kind of a reconstruction that we have about like the local knowledge about the role of that fish in the ecosystem. But what's important here is that it's precisely all this kind of knowledge that the community has that none of the external scientists have, the external ecologists, that is absolutely crucial if you want to respond to something like the oil spill, right? Because they know so much more about the fish there than a lot of the academic scientists. So the starting point is then to recognize the local communities as experts and peers in these kind of attempts to create better interventions. And then the second part is to study local ontological systems. And so how do you study like a local ontology, right? That's kind of like a tricky question. And of course, you can't like come up with like an inventory of like all entities that are local, that are included in a local ontology. So as I'm coming from philosophy of biology originally, we're kind of focusing on bio-ontologies, like the kind of local ways of classifying plants and animals. And given that those are fishing communities, what would be more obvious than to start with like kind of local ontologies and taxonomies of fish, right? And so the starting point there is rather empirical, and it kind of follows mostly like anthropological research methods. So we start with something that's called free listing, where you just talk with like the fishers and you ask, well, what kind of fish do you know? Like what kind of fish exist like here, right? And then they say, oh yeah, this fish and that fish and that fish and that fish, right? And then you do that with a lot of people. And then you come up with a list of like fish that people know, like the kind of local species that are assumed and how salient they are. And so then we have kind of like a set of local entities, right? But a local ontology is more than just like a random set of entities, right? Ontologies are structured. They're like assumptions about like what belongs together and how it's structured. And in order to kind of get a better idea of that, we do something that's called triad tasks, where we then look at the most salient species that the community assumes, and we show them 3 pictures, and we ask which of those, in this case birds, or which of those fish belong together, which are most similar, right? And then we run that over and over again, and then you can see like how different entities are grouped together as belonging together, as being more similar with each other. And that allows us then to kind of compare the local taxonomies of animals and of plants with the ways how scientists classify the biological world, right? And sometimes you'll find there are interesting similarities, like often local communities kind of divide the biological world in ways that are quite similar to the way how scientists do it. In another case, there are interesting ontological differences where they kind of divide the world in ways that are quite different from how scientists do it. And so I'm just going to provide you with one relatively straightforward example of like what's often called like taxonomic lumping and splitting. So cases where scientists would say, oh, here are 3 different species, right? But the local community only has one name for them, right? So they kind of lump them together as like one category of animal, right? But it's not always that way around. It can also be inverted, right? Where the scientists say, oh, this is like one species of fish, but the community say, no, those are 2 different kinds of fish, right? So they divide one academically recognized species into 2 different kinds of animals that have like local ecological roles, right? So often you'll find that the way how scientists and local communities kind of divide the world is quite different because they look at different properties of animals and they're just interested in different kinds of issues. And it's not that surprising that the case where the scientists are the splitters and the community are the lumpers are the birds, and it's the other way around with the fish, right? Because the community is much more interested in fish. They're fishers, right? They interact with the fish a lot, so they use a much more fine-grained ontology there. With birds, they don't really interact that much with them, so they kind of often lump them together where scientists have like a more fine-grained ontology. Okay, so that was just like to give you a little bit of an overview of the kind of empirical work that we're doing in Brazil, and hopefully we'll be able to set something up that's kind of similar with agriculture scientists here in Mexico. But in the end, of course, I'm talking to you as a philosophical community rather than like ethnobiologists. And in the end, those projects are also philosophy projects. So we're doing this empirical work in order to put it in conversation with kind of wider philosophical questions, in thinking about how do we address this diversity of ways of producing knowledge, and how do we address this diversity of kind of ways of dividing the world, right? And so one thing that you'll notice if you engage with development scholars or people in the environmental sciences, that there has been a lot of recognition of the need to engage with plurality of epistemic traditions or plurality of knowledge systems. So there's this whole kind of like bag of buzzwords that are going around in these communities about collaborative concepts like citizen science and co-creation and co-management and co-leadership and collaboration and interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity and multi-stakeholder governance and multi-stakeholder platforms and intercultural dialogue and so on, right? So people talk about that a lot. They come up with a lot of new words for it. And while all of these words have, of course, slightly different meanings, they all kind of reflect the idea that we need to bring together different actors who have different types of knowledge, who may have different metaphysical perspectives on the world. We have to figure out how to bring them together to create better solutions or better interventions, right? And so this is mostly happening in the empirical fields. It's, again, nothing that I think philosophers are engaging enough with, right? And I think that's problematic for both sides. It's problematic for philosophers, because philosophers are often kind of missing out on doing like work that's actually relevant, right? But it's also the other way around, I think, because part of, I think, what's happening in the empirical sciences is that a lot of these concepts are epistemologically very naive. They're not very reflective about what it actually means to bring different epistemic traditions together and what the challenges are of actually integrating different knowledge systems. And for me, as someone who's kind of now mostly working in an institute that's about development and that's about inclusive development, one thing that kind of annoys me as a philosopher is this kind of idea of what I call the one happy family pluralism, right? So the idea that you have like a bunch of different types of knowledge, right? And then you just add them up and you have much more knowledge and you come up with much better solutions, right? So people kind of then sometimes think of knowledge as these kind of liquids, right? They kind of stack up, right? And just as you have a fuller glass of liquids, if you just add them all, you just have much more knowledge in the end if you bring all these stakeholders together. And the problem with that is, of course, that that's not how knowledge negotiation works, right? It's not just propositional knowledge where you can just like add one proposition to another and then you have just more propositions of knowledge, but it's like different traditions of producing knowledge that are often very different from each other and that create all kinds of conflicts, right? So part of then the challenge is to understand how to relate different epistemic traditions and different kind of metaphysical perspectives that do not always integrate easily, right? And that's something that epistemologists have worked on quite a lot. Anthropologists have worked on quite a lot by showing, for example, how these kind of collaborative and transdisciplinary projects fail, for example, because scientists have just like such different methods of producing knowledge than indigenous communities, right? Think of an ecologist who works with mathematical modeling of like ecological dynamics, and an indigenous community that has like spiritual rules and ancestral narratives about how to engage with the forest. It's not really clear how to bring them together, even if we want to recognize both of them as experts, right? And it becomes even more difficult when it comes to the kind of underlying metaphysical assumptions that people have about the world, right? And that's often where scientists stop engaging with local knowledge systems and they kind of treat local knowledge more as an additional data source where they kind of pick the knowledge that's relevant for them, right? But when it comes to all this kind of stuff that they can't make sense of, I don't know, like forest spirits or, I don't know, shamanic transformation or stuff like that, they just ignore that, right? And that's not like then knowledge integration among equals. It's mostly scientists kind of picking additional data that's convenient for them. So how do we kind of address these kind of tensions? Well, one way of doing that, and that's kind of like what a lot of anthropologists do, is saying, well, the whole kind of idea of integrating different knowledge systems is just doomed, right? Because we're just like living in different worlds and there's just no way of bridging that, right? And that's of course something that people coming from philosophy of science are also kind of familiar with through all these debates about incommensurability, right? Where you could just say, well, the local knowledge system and the scientific knowledge system, they're just incommensurable, right? There's like no way of kind of understanding each other and kind of creating like a productive exchange. And I mean, there's something to that, right? I mean, especially for us right now working in Brazil, in the current political circumstances, right? You can very easily think of the current political situation as just a clash of incommensurable worlds. But then there's also something incredibly unsatisfying about it, right? Because it suggests that there's just no way of doing it better. There's just like no ways of creating understanding. There's no way of bringing local knowledge into scientific research, into policies, and creating more just interventions, right? So in the end, what we're aiming for, and we hope what we end up with, is something different than just like the purely integrative, like one happy family pluralism, or what I've kind of called the nihilist, like incommensurability that just claims we live in different worlds and there's just nothing we can do to understand each other, right? So the goal, and that's really much more a goal than something that's already fully developed, is to come up with some form of critical pluralism that can acknowledge the diversity of knowledge systems and ways of relating to the world, and the possibility of creating productive exchanges while being critically reflective about the limitations of that and the tensions that occur. Right? And so the starting point for that is, for us right now, what we call like a methodology of partial overlaps. So the idea that it's not like the one happy family pluralist assumes that everything just comes together easily, right? And then we just like create something better together. But it's also not that we can't understand each other at all, right? If we look at how knowledge systems work, we find there's quite a bit of overlap, right? That creates opportunities for productive exchange, that create opportunities to find common ground. And if you work in very concrete cases like us in those villages in Brazil, you run into that all the time. Of course, we're not just living in different worlds. If you sit in that boat together in the mangrove forest, right, you notice often that we have the same kind of ways of observing something, that we notice similar phenomena. And of course, there is overlap that allows us to understand each other, right? But at the same time, that overlap, right, is always only partial, right? Because there are also always quite substantial differences in how knowledge is created and how people think about the world. So part of that is then to kind of actively look for common ground for those overlaps while being reflective about their limitations and their partiality, right? So that's what we're trying to do. And so the next step for that would be for us to kind of develop a framework of how then different types of knowledge become negotiated, where the differences become recognized and common ground is being found. And something that we're kind of trying out, I don't know whether we're going to stick with that in the long run, is this notion of trading zones that some of you may be familiar with. That's become quite popular in history and philosophy of science, originally popularized by Peter Gallison in this book, Image and Logic, which is like a history of microphysics in the second half of the 20th century. So it's a quite different context, right? Like laboratories, physics, rather than like local communities. But what's interesting about the book and the notion of trading zones is that Gallison describes how people with very different methodological assumptions, very different ontologies, very different goals come together in a context like a laboratory, right? And they kind of coordinate and come up with novel ways of doing things despite these differences, right? So he describes trading zones as an intermediate domain in which procedures could be coordinated locally, even where broader meanings clashed, right? So people who had very different kind of background assumptions had still figured out how to coordinate in some way, right? And in this way, they managed to hammer out local coordination despite vast global differences, establish contact languages, systems of discourse, and so on. So thinking of what we're doing in these communities when we bring together scientists and local communities and philosophers and natural scientists and social scientists and so on as kind of establishing a trading zone, I think maybe like a productive way of framing that. Also because it allows us to think of I think, of this negotiation as something that's always deeply political, right? Because trade is something very political. Trade is not something that is like an exchange between equals usually, right? Because the reality of trade is that there are all kinds of inequalities built into it, right? So part of what we then need to do is not just develop an epistemology and ontology of these exchanges, but we also need to develop a political epistemology and a political ontology by understanding how that exchange of knowledge systems works, right? And so in Brazil, the original idea was that we would actually take that to the federal level and come up with kind of also like policy briefs and ideas of kind of how to negotiate or how to like build better trading zones. And then Bolsonaro got elected and all that kind of plan crumbled because there's just no way that government would be interested in something like that. So we're doing that more locally now, right? The idea of thinking of like the municipality as a trading zone where they come up with the community and the scientists, for example, with conservation plans. In Mexico, I'm going to be like, tomorrow I'm going to go to CIMMYT. Some of you may know that organization, that like big agricultural organization that's concerned with wheat and maize. And that is also, I think, like a very interesting trading zone in a way, because you have all these kind of agricultural scientists who work, for example, on maize varieties, right? But there's also a lot of interest there now in, for example, the cultural and political importance of maize for a lot of indigenous communities in Mexico. So that is also, I think, maybe an interesting trading zone to look at to see how different ways of knowledge about the environment, in this case, especially maize, is produced, right? So that's part of what I'm hoping is going to happen here. And so in the end, the idea then will be that, that we can get a better understanding of how knowledge is being negotiated, right, epistemically, but that we can also integrate that in a better political reflection on how that works, right? And so there are different ways of how local knowledge can become marginalized, right? So the first one is where, like think of the red dot as like the academic scientific knowledge, and the yellow one as local knowledge, where it's just the scientific knowledge that's being recognized as knowledge, right? And those were the stories that I started with, right? The kind of failed development projects in Bali and in Tanzania, where the assumption was, well, all the knowledge is just like the scientist's knowledge, right? That's one way of like failing to do that in an adequate way and how to marginalize local knowledge. But there are different, more complicated ways. One thing that a lot of people have become concerned with is that talk about inclusive and transdisciplinary methods kind of become instrumentalized, where the local knowledge only serves as an additional data source for the scientists, because the local knowledge is only recognized where it already overlaps, where it's convenient for the scientists, right? And all the stuff that people can't make sense of is being excluded. So I think the real challenge is to deal with that, where you recognize the differences between the knowledge systems and the tensions between them. And then you have to ask yourself, like, whose epistemology and whose ontology matters when you create, for example, an intervention, right? And so that's where we are, and where I think we will hopefully develop an interesting exchange between philosophical reasoning and these kind of more applied interventions. So in the end, and that's kind of where I end also with my talk, I think what I've outlined is kind of like an optimistic idea of like what philosophy can and should do, because I think philosophers have a lot to contribute to these kind of really important issues that shape people's lives around the world, right? Because a lot of the existing development interventions are not reflective enough on the underlying epistemological and ontological issues and tensions. And I think we as academic philosophers can contribute to that by being engaged with that, right? And so in that sense, I do think that as philosophers, we have like more to contribute that we actually currently do if we stay in our little academic bubble, right? But then at the same time, that also requires for philosophers to change, right? So because like I think a lot of the ways how epistemology and ontology is currently done often fails to engage with that because it's just not very well adapted to it, right? And so one of the parts I think we need to do is to think of philosophy as much more interdisciplinarily engaged, right? So that's why our research is philosophical, but it's also empirical, right? We also try to really like engage on a substantial level with local knowledge systems through methods of anthropology, of psychology, of social sciences, and so on. It needs to be transdisciplinary, right? So it needs to not only talk about communities, but it has to talk with the communities, right? And that's something that I think philosophers are not very used to, right? Because that's something that I think development scholars and to some degree environmental scientists have come to terms with, that they can't just talk about people, but they have to talk with them, right? But it's something that's quite difficult if you're used to kind of like your philosophical armchair, right? Because then you have to get out of it and you actually have to recognize people as epistemic agents themselves, right? And start a conversation. And then the last part is like philosophy as action research, right? Philosophy as not just engaging with abstract philosophical puzzles, but the idea that the abstract philosophical puzzles have like real life consequences, right? The way how we think about knowledge, how we think about ontology matters a lot. And it becomes materialized, for example, in how development regimes are structured around the world. So I think we actually, as philosophers, kind of have the responsibility to think about the real life implications of what we're doing there. And that's basically all I wanted to talk about for now. And I hope we have time for a little bit of a discussion. Thank you.
So as David said, we should collect some questions. Should I moderate, Carlos, or?
Sí, sí, sí.
Okay, so Lenny, please.
So I'm quite sympathetic into the project, but I spend a lot of time trying to figure out what seems to make sense to me as far as how to define the project, because I'm not loud enough. I can talk louder.
It's for the recording.
Oh, okay, okay. Because I didn't think, so this is for the recording. Okay, that makes sense. Because what you're talking about didn't strike me as really talking about development. Because to my mind, development's a much broader question. Let me, before I forget it, mention sort of where I come to at the end and then get back to how I get there. But it seems to me that what you're really addressing, I think I would suggest calling norms of ontological and epistemological justice. Now that might sound too much to you like the kind of ethics of development that you want to get away from. But I mean, I think it's a bit broader than that, and I think it is actually what you're addressing, and I'll try to explain why. So, I mean, development can mean many different things. The relevance of a larger sense of development, I think, I could maybe illustrate by something that you didn't discuss, which is the heterogeneity within local context. I mean, you spoke as if there is a local knowledge and then there is sort of the Western knowledge. But I know a little bit about, for example, Kenya. You talked about Tanzania. Kenya's next door. I know more about Kenya. Now, you can't talk about anything in Kenya without A, talking about corruption, and B, talking about tribalism. Now, any kind of epistemology, you're never going to get, for example, in Kenya, Kikuyu and Lao people working together for a variety of reasons, right? So you have heterogeneity at the local level, which is also amplified by political and economic tensions and so on and so forth. But even if we're talking about epistemological differences, right, I think the question of development in the larger sense is relevant. Why? Because it has to do, I mean, the larger topic has to do with things like modernization, the possibility of alternative modernities. I mean, for a while there was a lot of discourse about that. But what is that really about? I mean, it's about, amongst other things, decentering. And, what Habermas, who worked on this and got into trouble to some extent, would call the rationalization of different value spheres, right? Now, in order to have the kind of epistemological plurality that you're talking about, you need a certain level of decentering such that you have the development of technical rationality as an independent independent value sphere, which can be sufficiently separated from other value spheres of religion, morality, metaphysics, and so on. Right? I mean, you're assuming that, but I don't think that on the ground level it can really be assumed. Right? Now, on the other side of the spectrum, it seems to me that you're up against real world kinds of, as you say, political issues and so on. So, I mean, if what you're really talking about is not development as such, but economic development, scientific development, something of that sort, then it seems to me there's possibly some naivety in terms of the fact that, well, you are coming in with an idealization of, well, again, what Habermas would call something like an ideal communication. But if we look at Africa, and to a certain extent Brazil and Latin America, if we're talking about economic development, technical development, we're talking about the penetration of China. And so we're talking about specific interests, right? I mean, we're not talking about a neutral kind of let's make the world better kind of thing. We're talking about trade-offs and politics and so on, which is where it seems to me what you're doing could be very valuable to the extent that you can generate a set of epistemic and ontological norms which can be used to globally, to address the ways in which China, in particular, but other potential developers, as it were, introduce themselves into these local contexts, right?
Okay, thank you. So lots of points in there that I could address. Let me just maybe start with the question of why frame it in terms of development. I don't always do that, to be honest. Sometimes I frame it more in like terms of ethnobiology and knowledge diversity more generally. And a lot of these issues that I talked about are also appearing in contexts that are not development contexts, right? So for example, in the Netherlands, we also have projects about like how local farmers and scientists work together, which is definitely not a development context, but you also have like different knowledge systems within Europe, within rural communities and all that, right? So a lot of these issues are broader than development. The reason why I brought in development is more, if you want, a strategic reason, because it's such an important concept and policy concept that structures so much around the world, and that we as philosophers are not engaging enough with, right? So there's all the stuff like the sustainable development goals.
I was suggesting the opposite, not that what you're calling development is much more narrow than development properly understood.
Exactly, right. So that's the second point then. So what's like what I've been doing is, of course, only like look at like a subsection of what the whole development industry is about and what development policies are about. And a lot of them are, of course, much more straightforwardly connected to political questions and justice questions and all of that. And so part of your suggestion was, why not frame it in terms of that, right? And to some degree, I try to do that. That's why I'm talking about political epistemology, political ontology, right? So I think thinking of epistemic justice and ontological justice always has to be a part of this, right? But I don't just want to frame it purely in terms of justice, because then it just becomes another project in political theory, right? And another project in ethics. And so the idea is to try to argue that, if you want, the radical philosophers of science, epistemologists, ontologists need to engage with that on a substantial level at all, because they don't do it, right? And that then leads often to unjust interventions, right? But in order to figure out how the justice issues play out there, you also have to engage with kind of underlying theoretical questions. So what we're trying to do is to kind of look at this intersection, right? And that's why I don't purely want to frame it in terms of justice, but I want to frame it, if you want, like as the intersection between theoretical issues and justice issues.
La segunda intervención, the second question would be from Aide. She will formulate the question in Spanish.
Yeah.
He'll try to translate, and I'm sure it will be just.
If you speak slowly,
Lo voy a intentar porque habla muy rápido, pero bueno, te agradezco mucho la charla porque de alguna manera encaja mucho o tiene mucho que ver con discusiones que hemos tenido en el centro en el que trabajo, que es justamente de investigaciones interdisciplinarias. Y me parece que refleja muy bien una posición que no es la única que se tiene en ese centro, pero en la que yo me sitúo, de trabajo en equipo. O sea, la interdisciplina no la hace una sola persona, sino un equipo para una problemática concreta. Es que ese es comentario todavía. Pero efectivamente, yo quería preguntarte varias cosas, sobre todo del texto que leímos, aunque tiene que ver con lo que acabas de exponer, el texto que nos envió Carlos y lo que acaba de decir el colega. Me interesa porque es una forma de operacionalizar la trans y la interdisciplina, que conecta mucho con las perspectivas que acá hemos manejado de Rolando García, no sé si lo conozcas, pero al que seguro conoces es a Mike Davis, que Mike Davis cita los trabajos de Rolando García sobre la hambruna en el Sahara o en la África subsahariana de finales de los 70s. Pero que tienen que ver con sistemas socioambientales, en fin, no me voy a meter mucho a eso, pero la idea que manejamos acá es de construir en colectivo un marco epistémico común, que me suena mucho a lo que tú estás llamando los overlaps o superposiciones, ver en dónde conecta lo que se está discutiendo. Y eso me gustaría que lo abundaras un poco más, porque yo creo que en ese proceso hay muchas dificultades de escalas distintas. Es decir, habría que desmenuzar también la idea de caja de herramientas, de toolboxes, que señalas en el artículo, y por eso que digo de que son muchos niveles en los que se juega la discusión, y finalmente hay un momento de llegar a la decisión, que nosotros a veces llamamos escisión, porque tiene que haber en algún momento una toma de posición respecto a si el pájaro en realidad son dos o es uno, o sea, para cierta cuestión en concreto. Y luego la pregunta, quizá porque no lo abordaste ahora y tampoco está en el texto, de cómo salen de los conflictos cuando se llega a ese tipo de decisiones, o sea, cómo lo has experimentado tú en el campo. No sé si eso está claro.
Necessary to summarize. So basically, they're saying that she notices interesting similarities between some of your postulates or positions here with what she in her research center has been discussing for a long time with colleagues, right? And then finally, she was especially interested in knowing how do you manage conflict in the specific cases that you have been engaged. And also there was a second point about hay una segunda cosa. Yes. When it comes to problems of scales and when decisions have to be made, how do you interact with the other stakeholders to come out of those conflicting situations? There's also this concept of toolboxes that is developed in the manuscript that was circulated, and that's something that was interesting for her, and she would like you to give more detail about it in the context of what you presented during the talk.
Okay, so maybe I start with the last one, the toolbox, because that I think also related to what you said in the beginning about like how do we conceive these kind of transdisciplinary communities, right? And so part of what I think we experienced in the work that we've done so far is that the way how these transdisciplinary communities emerge are quite complicated, of course, and sometimes you find actual ways of integration where you kind of use the same epistemic tools, and sometimes you feel you're just like actually living in different worlds, right? So part of what you need to do, I guess, is to recognize like both where we can come together and then where the conflicts appear. And so we have some kind of pretty optimistic stories right now about how knowledge systems come together in our case. Like, for example, a lot of it has to do with conservation management there in those mangrove forests. So one thing we found in November, for example, is that this robalo fish that I talked about earlier, there's a period where the fishers are not allowed to catch, right? And that's imposed by, like, if you want, like the scientific system that says in order to maintain the population, there need to be 2 months where the fish are not being caught. But then the period where the fish are not being allowed to caught actually is not the same period where the fish spawn, right, where they lay their eggs. And that's something that the local fishermen told us, right? So that's like one of those cases where you have like, where we kind of try to design a better intervention based on the knowledge of the fishermen who say, no, like the spawning period is actually not the period where we're not allowed to fish. And where we have like a pretty straightforward integration of knowledge, right? And then there are other cases, of course, where these conflicts appear that you're interested in, right? And those are, of course, the hard cases of like, what do you do there? And so one notion that we're kind of toying with right now that's been coming from anthropology, like Viveris de Castro, for example, talks about ontological self-determination, right? So the idea of self-determination is, of course, very important in general in like these kind of policy regimes where, like the, for example, Declaration of Indigenous Rights starts with the self-determination of communities to decide like the way how they want to live, right? And then part of taking that into the philosophical domain would be to talk also about like epistemic or metaphysical ontological self-determination, that communities have the right to stick with their local ways of producing knowledge, of validating knowledge, of dividing the world, right? And in a way that would, of course, like the starting point is then kind of to invert the hierarchies as they usually appear in those projects, right? Where the assumption is when there's disagreement, then it's the scientist who makes a decision, right? And the local community that's being ignored. But that does not mean that I think that like just talking about self-determination is a simple fix. Right? Because what does self-determination actually mean and how far does it reach, and does it mean that scientists shouldn't change anything about local communities? All of these are very complicated questions that we're already running into. Just to give you like from these kind of ethno-ontological studies that we're doing like a very like small example, right? So as I said, there are local categories, right, of animals and plants that are different from the ways how scientists classify the biological world. And often we find that those differences reflect the local expertise about the environment and the kind of issues that they're concerned with. So we think it's important to preserve those local biontologies because they're important for people's way of life. But then there are also categories that seem quite problematic, right? So for example, there is this kind of category of useless fish, right? And that lumps together a lot of different fish from like a taxonomic point of view. And a lot of these, if they're caught as bycatch, they're just thrown on the beach, right? And then they die. And a lot of like the scientists that we work with there are like very horrified by that practice because a lot of these fish are actually threatened, right? So that's something where you may say, oh, well, the local like way of classifying the world, right, is actually against the interests of preserving the ecosystem and maybe also, yeah, and maybe also against the interest of the community itself, right? So there may be limitations of how far you want to take these kind of ideas of ontological self-determination, but that's like, of course, incredibly tricky to spell out. And that's one of the reasons why, even if this is a philosophy project, we try to go into the empirical details of working with concrete context, because I think you can only get it right if you kind of take the complexity of this reality into account.
Anyone else? Sí, ahí atrás.
Yo tengo la curiosidad de preguntar si en el trabajo que han hecho en campo han desarrollado estrategias para lidiar con el extractivismo, pensando en que hay ocasiones en las que, vaya, un académico se encuentra con algo novedoso, interesante, tiene la tentación de publicar sobre eso, pero uno no siempre está consciente de si el trabajo que publica puede servir para que después alguna farmacéutica se apropie de ciertas cosas, o casos más extremos. A veces, dentro del trabajo de las comunidades, desarrollan estrategias para sobrevivir ante intentos gubernamentales para entrar a esos territorios que ocupan. Y igual, si un académico cae en la tentación de dar cuenta de esas estrategias que han desarrollado las comunidades para sobrevivir y preservar su entorno y sus formas de vida, puede estarle haciendo el trabajo de inteligencia al Estado para entrar y acabar con ese tipo de cosas. Entonces, supongo que esto tiene que ver con la cuestión de las justicias y la ética de la investigación en este caso. Entonces, es algo que me inquieta.
Research ethics, in particular, how have you been dealing with the cases in which your discoveries, for instance, could be, when published, could actually be used against the interests of the communities? So he put two interesting examples, something related to biopiracy, for instance, and then the second was even more interesting from my perspective, which is when a social scientist or when this research results appear published in a social science journal, for instance, that can also, according to his account, be used against, by the state, for instance, against the interests of those communities.
Really important point, right? Because the whole idea of talking about knowledge diversity and local knowledge, it sounds like something that's politically good, right, to study that. But there are, of course, a lot of ways of misusing that, right? And I guess the bioprospecting ones are just like the most straightforward ones, right, where you engage with local knowledge about, for example, medical plans, and then you take that knowledge and you use it for your own purposes, right? And I think whenever you engage with local knowledge systems, there are risks, right? And the question is like, how do you mitigate those risks? And I think the most important one from like the kind of setup that we have in the research ethics perspective is to take the problem formulations, like take transdisciplinarity towards the problem formulations, right? To involve the community in the kind of questions that are supposed to be investigated. That it's not just we formulate the research questions and we see what local knowledge may be relevant for our questions, but we get involved with the community and try to figure out what questions do they want to address in this kind of like epistemic community that we're creating, right? And that's why we ended up with the oil spill, for example, right? That was nothing that we had in our mind in the beginning. We had like very different kind of questions in mind, right? But then the community like were eating fish where they weren't knowing whether it's toxic or not, and they weren't able to sell their fish anymore because people didn't know whether the fish is toxic or not. So that was like the issue that they wanted to address, right? And that's how our project shifted towards that. So I think in general the answer is that you kind of have to take transdisciplinarity upstream, right? So it's not just like giving back to communities at the end, right? Like once a project is done, but you involve the community as early as possible in the way how the research questions are being formulated in the first place. And that requires, of course, that's of course very difficult. And it's especially difficult for philosophers who are not very used to working with like anyone rather than books, right? But that's what we're trying to do there. Yeah.
Okay. Muy bien. Tenemos ahora a Carlos y después a Alonso.
Yes, thank you very much. I find your research very stimulating and very, I mean, it's right on the kind of things we as a community should be doing at this moment of time. But my question is about how much, because you didn't say much, how much do you in your research engage with the history of previous a long history of previous attempts by philosophers, historians, anthropologists of doing very similar things. Like in Mexico, we have like decades of projects from anthropologists, sociologists, philosophers, trying to engage with the situation of local knowledge and the development issue and how a very long list of strategies that have failed have been already very clearly analyzed and understood by historians of social sciences in Mexico. And I'm sure similar things you will find in Brazil or other regions with such richness of diversity, cultural diversity. So my question is, wouldn't that be necessary? For instance, in this institute we have Leon Olivet, a philosopher of science, 2 decades ago started a group that specifically addressed the question of multi versus pluralism and how to engage with local knowledges and what a philosopher could, what was the role of philosopher in those interactions. And there's many students who have written PhD theses here. And I think there could be interesting things for you to be. It's like, it feels like you are sometimes, it feels like that. I'm not accusing you. Like you are sometimes, landing in a territory that seems unexplored, that from the social sciences, the philosophy, and you're trying to propose a new way of dealing with issues that have already been dealt with. So the question is, how much time are you willing to dedicate to find out what other people have been doing? Ambrosio Velasco here is one. He arrived late because he was confused with a date. But he's one of the philosophers who have been writing about these issues in Mexico. And so that's the question. It's not an accusation. It's just
I completely understand. I think you're right that, I didn't really talk about history much aside from like the history of the development concept and how that often has led to failed interventions. And to a degree, I find that quite a pity because I've been originally trained as a historian of biology, right? And now I'm doing this kind of stuff. But it's not because I would think that historical reflection there would be irrelevant. Obviously, it's incredibly relevant in order to make projects like this critically reflective, right? It's just part of, I guess, a complexity of engaging with these kind of issues where as a philosopher of science, I'm already having to learn how to do qualitative anthropological research and how to engage with the current state of policy and political ecology debates, and then I'm engaging with environmental scientists about the natural science stuff, and somehow there's only so much space that you can offer, what you can do, right? And so some of the historical reflection has not, I think, so far gotten the space that it deserves, right? And I very much hope, because we're only at the beginning of this, right, and these projects will run for 5 years, that we'll get to that point of where we can underlie that also with a more critical historical reflection about what's been done and how these kind of concrete interventions relate to that. I guess we didn't start with that because one of the risks of if you only start with history is that you don't get to the interventions, right? And so part of what we wanted to do is because there are such pressing social environmental issues, we wanted to put the need for practical intervention, the politics of it first, right? Rather than just starting with the history. But we have to get to the history. And I guess part of that is you just can't do projects like this as an individual researcher, right? So a lot of this is teamwork. And we're building a community of people working together with different types of expertise. And I very much hope that historians will be be much more involved in that as well, because they should play an important role in that kind of community, right? But in the end, that type of research, even if in a way it's philosophical research, it's nothing that you can do in like a traditional single-authored book or paper. It's something that you have to do in a community of people, right?
So before allowing Alonso to ask a question, I just want to mention that the issue of teamwork that you used first now is something that I was also stressing.
Hello, thank you for your talk. I want to ask you about the relation between philosophy and development, because I think there's a sense that we're all in a rush to engage, and there's no time for critical thinking. But as I saw it, as in philosophy, we should first conceptualize this development as a political project, which has a lot of assumptions and an agenda which needs to be like reviewed. In the sense he was saying some issues, as you plan or as you propose that all this is for better interventions. In a lecture from political theory, it's like one step further in the rationalization that Max Weber was telling about, that is, introduce economic, bureaucratic, and judicial criteria each time in anywhere in the earth, right? So it's like, I think you're pursuing that political project of just rationalizing everything, and that's like the major objective of planning, like make those rational subsystems, the bureaucratic, the economic, and the judicial systems more efficient in places where there wasn't that system like incorporated. So I got one example. For example, there's a book that is called Scientists and World Order, which is of the 70s, and they review how the development plans were posed at that epoch, and more or less they were kind of identical of right now. Like proposing that there was an urge because the human survival was at stake. But they, as social scientists, like in the introduction, they said, we can't accept that premise because it's not that simple. So I was hoping to find like more a philosophical view about these kind of assumptions that make this kind of political projects, which are not as simple as they sound. And from the perspective of some other research, they had a lot of ethical and moral and scientific debates that are ongoing. So I just wanted to point that.
Right, there are of course a lot of these wider issues that I didn't have time to talk about, but I would very much think that I wouldn't want to frame it in terms of efficiency, right? So it's not about making development more efficient, it's about making it more reflective, right? Because the issue of showing how different political projects and development are entangled with different ways of relating to the world, different metaphysical perspectives, different epistemologies. It's not just one of like creating like more efficient interventions. It's about showing how like different ways of relating to the world create different visions of what development should be in the first place, right? And this is not about efficiency. It's about like what kind of future do you want to create, right? And I think that's where a lot of the real philosophical work comes in, right? And kind of showing how like the straightforward political issues of interventions are related with these kind of underlying different visions of like the way how we look at the world, the way how we relate to the world, and the kind of futures that we want to create.
I have two questions. Thank you very much for your presentation. Which characteristics does a scientist need to develop in order to put into practice this approach? That's my first question. And my second one is more related with power structures of domination. How does this approach incorporate or deals with the historical, social, political structures of power, in specific colonialism, patriarchy, and colonialism, patriarchy, and capitalism. Thank you very much.
Okay, so those are both like very important questions, but also very, very broad questions that of course have no simple solutions, right? So I think part in terms of the characteristics that scientists have to develop is first of all, they need to become more reflective, right, about like their own positioning, right? And so there's a part of like understanding, for example, how different interventions are related to different worldviews or different ways of relating to the world, where scientists typically just assume like their own ones is correct, right? And so part of like doing that is to just become reflective, right? But then reflexivity, of course, is not enough, right? As a scientist, you also have to become responsive, right? So you shouldn't just think about it, but you have to talk with people and you have to respond to their perspective. You need to become an engaged researcher. And so that's, in a way, the idea of participatory research, right? That you're not just talking about people, but you're talking with people, right? And then the last part would be the kind of action research that I pointed out in the end, right? That as a researcher, you have to be aware of the kind of like real-world impact that you have. And so you have to explicitly address that and try to have the right kind of impact. And I think all of this applies not just to scientists in the sense of empirical scientists, but it should also apply to philosophers, right? And this is like much more difficult, of course, for philosophers to not just talk about people, but with people, and to do action research and participatory research. But that's why we're trying to develop this methodology of coming up with a way of doing philosophy that can have these kind of characteristics. And I think part of that then also relates to your second questions of like how to engage with like the power structures that shape development, that shape interactions between scientists and communities, right? Whether it's like colonial hierarchies or racism and sexism and capitalism and all the other things that kind of put these communities often at the margins of societies and often like make them losers of the kind of development intervention that are supposed to help them, right? And so as I said earlier, I think part of what scientists, in order to be responsible, need to do is they need to actually go to the communities that they're talking about, right? And they need to be willing to change their own research questions and their own methodology according to what the community wants and needs. Right? And again, that's why we're trying to do it the way I presented, right? That we as philosophers are doing fieldwork, we as philosophers are spending time in the communities, we're asking what kind of issues do you want to address? Of course, that doesn't mean that these power structures disappear, right? They're always there. And it's very obvious if there's a team of researchers coming into the communities that a lot of these hierarchies are maintained, right? But of course, we can try to be more reflective about it, and we can try to do it better, even if we can't just dissolve, of course, like the global hierarchies that are there. And there are, of course, a lot of like things that you can do in order to do that. Part of it is like how do you structure the research teams, right? So part of it is kind of developing collaborations with like the local universities that are most close to the communities and have the best understanding of their social environmental problems. Part of it is just setting up, for example, the right kind of, for example, ways of how you structure interactions and focus groups and workshops that try to explicitly address the hierarchies that are there. But yes, of course, there are no simple fixes to these issues, otherwise we wouldn't face them anymore, right?
So we still have time, but not so much. Carlos and I are in the list, but Tania is asking to ask her question first because it's closely related to this previous question.
Hi, David. I want to ask you about your experience in Brazil, because My question is very similar to your question, Ismael, because in a quick view, we can think that the political structure in Brazil and the communities' knowledge, the integration of knowledge between the communities and the political government, there is a space like that. There are incommensurability. I don't know how to say in English, but in your experience, how these communities can or not negotiate with this huge and very opposite power, or is not so opposite?
With this type of research in the current circumstances in Brazil, it's very difficult and challenging, and I think it's also theoretically interesting. Maybe also I talked with Francisco about that the other day, and like comparing Brazil and Mexico in that, right? Because it's like very, like if you want, like two very different examples of how this issue of local knowledge becomes incorporated into government structures, right? So in current Brazil, local and indigenous communities are largely seen as like standing in the way of modernity, right? Because like the Bolsonaro government wants to kind of push its agri-food industry further, right? And so environmental protection and local ways of doing are standing in the way of that, and they're pushed aside. So the kind of work that we're doing is, at the federal level, definitely not wanted, right? Mexico currently, with like someone like Victor Toledo becoming part of the government, right? There's like a very different way of how that becomes incorporated and becomes part of like the official narrative of a government. And I think there is something where you could do comparative analysis quite interestingly, where you would need a lot of history, right? And kind of untangling how these questions of local knowledge become incorporated in different policy structures in different countries like Brazil and Mexico. What we're doing in Brazil now, though, in the current situation, is that we're just trying to go local, right? So because Brazil, as every country, is incredibly complex, right? And the Bolsonaro government is not all that's there, right? There's, for example, a local municipality that we're working with, and the local municipality in Brazil has quite a lot of power in terms of, for example, setting up conservation areas. So we're working with the local like the local politicians, the scientists and the community, and setting up like a conservation project, right? And then, of course, part of the question will be like how to relate, if you want, like local policy making to federal ones. But that's something that we'll just have to see how it goes, because right now, who knows where Brazil is going to be a year from now? Who knows whether 5 years from now, when the project is going to end, we'll even be able to do that work anymore. I mean, yeah.
So, Carlos, do you want to add first? Yes.
David, so to ask my question, I will tell a little anecdote. So my previous boss in the place where I work, which is the Institute of Biology here at UNAM, is an ethnobiologist. And for many years he was kind of dismissive about having philosophy of science in the place, because he claimed many times that ethnobiology, or at least his own version of ethnobiology, already includes philosophical reflection, so epistemology. So that's kind of an interesting thing to reflect upon after listening to your talk, because that would lead us to ask, then why ethnobiologists in Latin America have never actually proposed explicitly an epistemology of ethnobiology project, for instance, no? So, so then that's the first question. No? What especially considering your experience in Brazil, how do you deal with the fact that sometimes certain Latin American ethnobiologists claim that they already include philosophical reflection of sorts within their practice as ethnobiologists, right? The second question has to do actually with Toledo, right? Victor Toledo, that we have already mentioned here a couple of times, would probably claim that his writings about memoria biocultural and his schemes about cosmos praxis and so on are already an epistemological framework to deal with conceptual issues in ethnobiology, right? So have you considered people like Toledo in the global north? So prominent ethnobiologists like Wolverton or maybe Eugene Hahn, perhaps also, who sometimes have also claimed that. How do you deal with those claims now made from the main voices that have actually defined what ethnobiology is at an international level, right? Those two first questions I'd like to ask. Yeah.
Probably try to answer them together. I mean, first of all, I would be inclusive about the question like who's doing epistemology and ontology. It's not just people who are sitting in philosophy departments, right? So I think there's a lot of, if you want, the radical innovation coming from people who are doing ethnobiology or environmental science or development sciences or political ecology or whatever, right? That we as philosophers have a lot to learn from, right? And I would include Toledo in there, definitely. And so that's something that I also, where I had earlier this slide was like all these kind of buzzwords that are outside of philosophy currently happening, right? All the talk about like multi-stakeholder approaches and intercultural dialogue and participatory research and transdisciplinary. All of that has like epistemological depth, right? And a lot of this has been developed outside of academic philosophy, right? So I don't think we should be arrogant as philosophers. I think we should just like learn, first of all, from people there, right? But then at the same time, when engaging with a lot of these concepts, I also feel they often kind of lack depth and reflection where philosophers can contribute with their tools, right? And I find that quite obvious in a lot of the ethnobiological literature, right? So the stuff that's been done in North America, like by people like Hahn and Berlin, it's often explicitly philosophical, but it's often lacking the kind of reflection on the state of debates, for example, in philosophy of biology, by having like very simplistic ideas of like natural kinds that are recognized by the scientists and the indigenous people, and that's why everyone's taxonomies kind of converge. And that's often like a very simplistic philosophical picture where if you would bring in the state of research that's been done in philosophy of science, you end up with something much more interesting, much more meaningful, right? And I mean, I feel the same is also true for a lot of the kind of like ethno-ecological debates that I think have been theoretically innovative, especially here in Mexico, and philosophers can learn from it. But I think philosophers could also contribute to these debates quite a bit, right? By bringing in whether it's like more like epistemological questions or the current state of political theory and so on. So I think it's more about creating a knowledge exchange between academic communities and saying, well, like we have like epistemology reserved for ourselves as philosophers.
And then the final point was related with the
so-called ethnobiology 5, right? Which coming from the ethnobiological work and proposals of those same Global North researchers seems to have many things in common with some of the aspects related to politics and ethics of your own proposal. So how do you relate your project to those claims?
Right. So maybe for the people who are not working that much on ethnobiology, like the way how the field has developed is that it has become has developed from something that's much more theoretical about, you know, comparing taxonomies and like documenting local knowledge to something that's much more political, right? And that's much more intervention oriented and talks much more about the injustices and all of that. And so that's been called like ethnobiology 5, the kind of applied ethnobiology that looks at like what local knowledge actually does for local people, how scientists can contribute to that and all of that.
Reference to 4 previous phases.
Right. And so I think a lot of this, what I've been talking about, is kind of in line with that, right? Because it also tries to emphasize the applied political dimension of that. At the same time, I think there is a risk in how it's being framed, kind of ethnobiology as now being applied ethnobiology, where it's just about like like the practices, that it lacks the kind of theoretical reflection that's necessary to come up with the right kind of practice interventions, right? So part of this, I think, like we have to become more applied also as philosophers, right? That was one of the messages, right? But that doesn't mean that we should like kind of step away from theoretical reflection, right? Because like better practices require better theory, and better theory requires better practices, right? We have to think of them as integrated, right? And I think that's where I would see like the relevance of a project like this in the current ethnobiological landscape.
So now it's Carlos' turn, and then Aide, and probably that would be, let's see.
The question I would like to ask, if you are considering within the diversity of actors, a special kind of actors that I think at this stage, at this period of time, are increasingly present, which is local people who have grown up in diverse settings, metaphysical, ontological, cultural, that at the same time are educated, they go to university, and they become like the perfect, not the perfect, but adequate translators from one world to the other. And so in this building of a critical pluralism, you have a privileged actor that can, because that's increasingly the case in Mexico. We have more and more people that come from different regions and different groups, and that have become engineers or biologists, and those actors, I think, should be taken into account in these kind of projects. And the second question has to do with I mean, probably that's not the case, but the sense one gets from how you present is that the only ones that have access to all that was going on in the project are the ones that are in Amsterdam but the Brazilians don't know what's going on in Mexico or in other parts, and I think that gives you an avoidably privileged situation, whereas you should, I think, aim for a more horizontal like interactions where the othernesses are all in contact, and this pluralism is real pluralism and not...
Right. Yeah, no, you're very right. Especially important, but let me start with the first point. So of course there are people who can kind of bridge between different knowledge systems because they have identities in different ones, right? And so I think there's always like, I mean, labels are difficult anyway, right? So and like whenever you talk about these issues, you come up with problematic labels, like for example, scientific and indigenous, right? But an indigenous person can be a scientist as well, right? Or like traditional and academic, but a traditional person can be an academic as well, right? So all kinds of labeling are problematic, and the people who are often most capable of navigating these kind of tensions are people who kind of fit different labels, right? Because they've kind of grown up in a local community and then received an academic education, and they can kind of move back and forth between these kind of epistemic traditions, right? And so I very much agree that that's like a group of people who play an important role in or should play an important role how this kind of trading zones between different knowledge systems are structured. Part of the reality is, of course, that you can, of course, incorporate, for example, indigenous representatives who have also university education and like government context or something like that. But in a lot of the local context, right, like the villages that we work with, there are no people who have who have been trained as scientists, right? So I think often the reality of social hierarchies is that people do not get to kind of transfer between these worlds, right? And then you still have to figure out what to do about it. And then part of that is, of course, then related to your second questions, is like how do you try to structure projects like this as equally as possible? And part of part of the problem is that of course a modern university system is not very attuned to creating horizontal structures, right, and collaborate teams like this, because there's like grants that I had to apply from like European research foundations, and then I have to respond to them, and I have all these responsibilities, so they have all these hierarchies built into them. That doesn't mean that you can't subvert them to some degree, right, and that's something that we're trying to do. And I mean, part of that is also, for example, then the question, as we're now just getting started about it, is like, how are we setting this up? And so that in part that's why I'm here in Mexico, and why I'm like a lot in Brazil, trying to also figure out how to build the kind of collaborative structures that are less hierarchical, right? And I think the starting point is not to just hire a bunch of European researchers who go into these communities, but to kind of build the local collaborative teams here. But of course, like the institutional reality is these hierarchies are there, and we have to, even if we try to subvert them, they're difficult or often impossible to completely get rid of. Yeah.
Okay, so Aide, and then Ambrosio, and then we are done.
Three questions. La primera, pero breves. One is easy. Do you know, and what do you think about the proposal of Boaventura de Sousa Santos, el diálogo de saberes y la justicia epistémica, el epistemicidio, etc.? La otra es, justo estuve en Sucre, en la Sociedad Latinoamericana de Etnobiología, y la discusión ahí, más que en términos epistemológicos o filosóficos, lleva siempre a la cuestión política. Y esa yo creo que atraviesa necesariamente necesariamente la resolución de los problemas más allá de lo epistemológico y lo ontológico. Y la última es, what kind of unresolved problems have occurred in the work team? Si nos puedes contar cuáles son los problemas que has tenido en tu equipo de trabajo y que no se pueden resolver, porque entiendo que entonces el equipo va cambiando, no el equipo con la comunidad, sino tu equipo de trabajo va cambiando. Si hay alguien que ejerza un liderazgo, si la problemática atraviesa sobre todo por lo etnobiológico, si tú coordinas o coordina la antropología o coordina la sociología, ¿cómo se resuelven ese tipo? Que tiene que ver con lo que el compañero decía de las habilidades, skills, no epistemológicas, sí ontológicas, si tú te has desplazado de tu lugar, o sea, ¿qué es lo que tú has modificado en tu propia ontología a partir de ese diálogo con interdisciplinario y transdisciplinario?
There are aspects of the third one that are interesting. I will try to say something about that in English. In the third question is asking about if you have actually yourself changed or displaced yourself in terms of being sometimes at the center, but sometimes leaving a space for another academic collaborator to actually lead the way.
So the first question, like was epistemologies of the South, which I think is, I think that's like a very inspiring framework that also something that's interestingly not coming out of academic philosophy that much, but mostly reflected within like social sciences. They engage much more with that framework than academic philosophers, and I think that's a great starting point where academic epistemologists should engage with more. So I think that's an important framework that we are actually also working with to some degree. Then the second question was, remind me again,
De Sucre, dijiste algo. Sí, el peso de lo político en realidad en estas discusiones.
The way which at the Society for Biology in Sucre, she noticed that the political was always in front.
Exactly. So and that related, I think, also to earlier question that we had about what's the role of justice considerations and all of that. And so I think part of emphasizing the epistemological and ontological parts is not to depoliticize them, right? The political is, of course, at the center, at the front, but part of it is to show how they're entangled with each other, right? So for better politics, right, you need like critical epistemological reflection, right? And for the right kind of critical epistemological reflection in these contexts, you have to understand its political dimensions, right? So I think part of this would not be to say, oh, there's too much talk about politics, right? But rather that critical, reflective political interventions require also the kind of reflection on a more theoretical level about epistemological and ontological issues. And then the third part was about what the team, right? And also my own role in that, which kind of related, I think, to your earlier question. And I mean, we're just getting started, right? So the project, the one project started officially in November, the other one started like 2 weeks ago, right? And then like in February. And so we still have to see how all of that works out. But as I said earlier, I think the way it's set up, it's deeply problematic, right? There's no way around it. Like it's funded from European sources, and I, as a European researcher, is supposed to kind of coordinate that and be the boss of it all. And a lot of it is extremely problematic, right? And so part of what we're trying to do, of course, set it up in a way where we can also address these issues, but we'll have to see how that works in the kind of institutional realities that we're working with, right? So part of, I think, what would be ideal, which also related to what you said earlier, is that to find, for example, PhD students who come from the communities that we work with, right? That would be the best thing. And it would kind of be a way of course, creating a better dialogue, empowering people, giving like also like for me to step back and making some of the decisions. But then in those projects, in order to do a PhD, right, you have to move to the Netherlands. And you have to fulfill all the criteria of the university in which the project is located. And part of that means, for example, you have to, in order to get your PhD, you have to publish 4 peer-reviewed articles in English, right? And a lot of people in the communities don't speak English, right? And so even like finding other like more local collaborators as PhD students can be difficult, given that there are all these kind of institutional requirements, right? So I think, I don't think I have solutions to that, but I think part of, like, I guess the starting point is to recognize how problematic a lot of this is, and also how problematic my own position as kind of like the coordinator of a project like this is, and try to react in it in ways that sometimes subvert the way how things are supposed to be set up.
Última pregunta, the last question.
Thank you very much. Sorry for being late. Your talk was, I thought your talk would be at 12, but it was 11. Sorry for that. My question is related with the last questions and your answers. And mainly is which will be the best strategy to foster the transdisciplinary dialogue, and more than just dialogue, a collaboration in the production of knowledge. Carlos mentioned that indigenous people that come to the university and get a PhD or whatever are very good translators and facilitate communications. But I think that at the end, the academic communities, either in science or in philosophy and humanity, are very closed and do not appreciate other kind of knowledge. In some of the few things that Kuhn is right, is precisely in this dogmatic character of the scientific, but also philosophers and any kind of humanities. So even though we try to foster a dialogue, there is, I would say, an epistemic, institutional, disciplinary barriers. So another way, a strategy, well, just to mention something, the big problems of our director of CONACYT is in part, not only, but in part due to this recalcitrant, ¿cómo podemos decir? Cuadrados, or this dogmatic view or not open view of science and knowledge. Excuse me?
I think it's authoritarian.
Yes, okay, yes, but mainly they don't see that they are authoritarian. They see that it's the right scientific or the right philosophical way of it, but it's part of the formation of our formation. So at the end, I think that it is necessary, and it's a part of the proposal of Boaventura, no? Radical, to start with some transformation of the structure of the universities, and let the holders of local and indigenous people to teach us, to be part of our research teachers. Excuse me? Well, yes, ecology of knowledge. Yes, thank you. But this we need to integrate it to the institutional, I think, institutional structure of our universities. Very hard. I don't. Do you know any experience? Well, first of all, would you agree with this, that this transformation of universities or the places where scientific and humanists are educated needs a radical transformation? And if you know some experience in that sense, we have started very little with a program at the bachelor level called exactly almost the name of your talk. Desarrollo y gestión interculturales. I don't know how to translate gestión, but it's not management. I don't know how to translate gestión. Well, but it's very akin with, and it has been a very successful program at the bachelor level. We have this program in 3 different campuses in the country, and well, but it's very little. And it was continually rejected, ¿cómo se dice despreciado? Dismissed by all philosophers, historians, literarians. No, what is this? We don't need this kind of rollos, no, in a Faculty of Humanities. So I would like to know your opinion, and if you think this possible, if you know some experience in this transformation of the university. Thank you.
Right. So I mean, I would definitely agree that there is need for quite radical transformation in order to address these issues in a more adequate way. As I talked earlier more about like kind of the institutional setting of how these grants are, right, that kind of limit us. But then there are, of course, the institutional settings of the university, and then, of course, of the academic fields in which we're working, right? And in a way, academic philosophy is like the worst, right, in many ways, and in the way how it excludes work that is not produced in a certain way, in a certain language, and so on and so on. I mean, of course, these issues are so persistent because there are no easy ways of like changing them, right? But I mean, I think projects like this create quite a few opportunities of trying in creative ways of changing how things are being done, and also kind of subverting some of the rules in the disciplines that we're engaging with, right? And so one thing that I said earlier in response to your question is that a lot of this work is, even if it's philosophical, it's teamwork, right? And so part of us saying we want to learn from local communities and we want to learn from like a diverse group of stakeholders also means that the intellectual products of what we're doing are kind of not just like the product of one person, right? And so like one thing that we're currently like developing more is to also try to integrate that in the way how we do philosophical research and writing, right? And so we'll see how that goes, but a lot of our philosophical papers, for example, they will be submitted to the mainstream English-speaking journals, but they will be submitted with 5 or 6 or 7 authors, of which a lot of the people are like not very familiar with, like the rules of academic philosophy. And that's something where I think we can kind of create also spaces for people, right? Where, like, for example, I can learn from people's local experiences and expertise on these issues, and then I can bring in my experience on how to do this kind of like publishing stuff, right? And create kind of like a more diverse academic community that currently in academic philosophy obviously does not exist. But to what degree these kind of like attempts to kind of change how things are being done are going to be successful or not, we'll have to see. But I definitely agree that there's a need to transform these things in often quite radical ways. Yeah.
On that note, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
For coming, and thank you, David.